in the migration group, we have done a couple of things because I am a co-investigator with Peter Beyer. So it's the migration group that actually developed the non-religion survey. That was our first project. Now we're getting into a second project that focuses on refugee policies and reception and settlement of refugees. And let me just try to share screen to briefly outline this project. I'm sorry about my PowerPoint. It's actually very boring compared to the others, but here it goes. So after developing the survey, we wanted to focus more on migration policies and to see in which way is non-religion actually considered within migration policies. And we decided to narrow it down to refugees instead of including all sorts of migrants, like labor migrants, for example. So we outlined a few main questions. To what extent is religion used to shape, ignore, obscure, geez, I can't even see my own PowerPoint, so sorry. Non-religion and non-religious identities in the context of refugee reception and settlement. How is non-religion negotiated in this context? How do public and private non-religious sponsoring organizations understand religious, non-religious needs? In what ways might current practices shape future inclusion and exclusion? So these are some of the questions that we're operating with. What we decided was to do, just a second here, a three-step study. So we have just started on the first step, which is the context. And what we're looking at here is the organization of reception and settlement of refugees. And we actually had a meeting last night, or it's the evening for me, or yesterday for the rest of you, where we had presentations from Australia, Canada, and the Nordic countries. So what we asked to outline the context is, where do refugees in each country come from? In these contexts, we found out that they come from fairly similar countries, especially since 2015, when you had the so-called refugee crisis. We saw that Syrians is a large group in all the countries, for example. What are the immigration policies regarding refugees and asylum seekers? Also, in these three contexts, we found that we had fairly similar policies in the sense that all the countries practice kind of a tough front, meaning restrictive immigration policies. But once refugees were accepted, we had what we in the Nordic countries call a softer inside. Once they are accepted, they obtain rights and actually achieve quite a bit of support. What are the institutional arrangements regarding refugee reception and settlements? We went into some detail, but we also found out that a major difference between Canada, Australia on the one side, and the Nordic countries on the other side has to do with sponsorship. The Nordic countries don't allow private sponsors. It's the state that is permitting who can enter and who cannot. To some degree, they will open up, at least in Norway, for certain NGOs that are approved by the state to function as they can give advice of who should be allowed to enter. But I looked at all of the organizations that Norway has approved, and all of them are non-religious. It's like the Red Cross pen for persecuted authors and academics, etc. Whereas in Canada, Australia, religious organizations can also be sponsors, which actually opens the door for religious organizations to play a role in the reception of refugees. Once refugees are accepted in the Nordic countries, at that point, religious organizations do play a role, because they are often contacted in order to provide for refugees, to welcome them in smaller cities, etc., to help integration. So at the point, whereas in Nordic countries, religious organizations seemingly don't play a role in the reception of refugees, they do play a role in the integration process of refugees. So that's the difference between these countries. So which religious, non-religious voluntary organizations are involved in Australia? The Roman Catholic Church and its organizations played a main role in, as far as I remember, both in the reception and integration of refugees. Do governments prioritize the reception of certain religious, non-religious refugees? What we found is that these governments seem to prioritize persecuted groups like gay, lesbians, etc., sexual minorities. But also there has been a debate lately in several countries to prioritize Christian migrants and to minimize the number of Muslim migrants. So that was, but I think it's more at the debate stage than its actual policy, or maybe it's policy at the very initial stage. We ended up the session last night, which was very interesting, because we're now getting into data collection phase and can kind of outline a few findings. We ended up with a discussion of why are the policies different and similar. For example, in the Nordic countries, we find that Sweden is much more liberal than Denmark and Norway when it comes to reception of refugees. The integration policies are slightly different with, I won't go into details, but we ended up with a very interesting discussion about political right-wing parties and their role, perception of nationhood in the different countries, and how that plays into both reception and integration policies. So next time we will have Argentina and Brazil. We found that the 3 presentations for 1 hour was too much, but so we wanted to only focus on 2 countries that are very different than the ones we had last night. So this will be interesting to see the differences. Our next stage, which we've not started on, will be a media analysis. How are specific groups of refugees imagined, or in websites, debates? Is there a tendency to align national ethnic identity with religious identities? Are people who come from Muslim majority countries assumed to be Muslims, for example? How are refugees from countries that have no commonly recognized religious majority framed in this regard, from Southeast Asia, for example? Who contests such framing? What is the basis of such contestation? Which groups are involved in contest these types of framing? Some of us have got an interest in the debate on secular Muslims, for example. And then finally, we will also conduct an ethnographic study at refugee reception centers, for example, and ask, how do employees deal with refugees? What do they do when people arrive? What do refugees tell about what they were offered? which religious, non-religious group have access and are active at the refugee centers? Is it so that particularly religious group try to have religious events or recruit at these centers, which we know in some countries is taking place? Is it possible to negotiate and or claim a non-religious identity at these centers? So this is kind of our approach. We just started this 3-step study, and we will probably focus most over the summer to finalize this about the context for these policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Inger. I really like the way the Migration Project has clearly articulated its research goals and its program of research. It's come along really well. One of the things I'd like to mention is that the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada emphasizes student training. And so in each of the projects, what we've tried to do is include students. We decided early on to include students in the conversations, the research design conversations. Sometimes I'm sure that can be pretty painful for them because we debate, we discuss, and it may seem rather a lengthy process, but it is how research is, good research, I think, is designed. And Inger has particularly been excellent at mentoring students and ensuring that they've felt included in the conversations and ensuring that they felt supported. So not only the substantive development of the Migration Project, but also as a model for mentoring students. Thanks very much for that, Inger. Community Gardens is next with Doug Ezzy, and